So the question of why are white people called Caucasian lies at the foundation of my 2010 book, The History of White People. People ask me, why did you write that book? And I said, I wanted to understand why white people are called Caucasian.
Have you ever wondered why we use the word Caucasian to mean white? It's not great. It comes from an 18th century scientist named Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. This guy took a look at the entire diversity of humanity and divided it up into 5 races. You might have heard of them. His races were Ethiopian, Mongolian, American, Malay, and Caucasian. He mostly based these divisions on human skulls that he had studied. And for each race, he included a diagram of a skull from that part of the world. That brings us to Caucasian. The Caucasian skull was from the Caucasus Mountains in the country of Georgia. Why Georgia? Well, Blumenbach thought that that skull was the prettiest. I am not making this up. Because this scientist thought that the people from the Caucasus Mountains were the most attractive, that must be where white people came from. Science, I guess. This is what Georgian people actually look like. I mean, they look just fine. I just don't think they're what a white supremacist thinks about, when they think about their race. Anyway, that's why we say Caucasian. It's weird.
Why do you say Caucasian? What's wrong with calling them white? Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I just personally like to refer to my pale-skinned friends as Caucasians because it sounds cool. What do you prefer?
Caucasian.
Why?
Because when I think of Caucasian, I'm thinking like skydiver or badass bull rider or somebody that like hunts hogs out of a helicopter. When I think white, I'm thinking like accountant. Or somebody who's like exceptionally good at cornhole. Caucasian, white, Caucasian, white. I'm going Caucasian every time, baby. Caucasian for life.
Here is why calling white people Caucasian is upholding white supremacy. So the name Caucasian actually refers to the indigenous people of the Caucasus Mountains of West Asia. The irony is that a lot of the actual Caucasians wouldn't even be considered Caucasian in America. How did this happen? In the late 1700s, a racist German pseudoscientist named Johann Blumenbach created a pseudoscientific racial classification on how attractive he found different skull shapes to be. He had a collection. When he saw the skull of a Georgian woman from the Caucasus, he determined it to be the most beautiful, and thus being the white supremacist that he was, concluded that all white people originate in the Caucasus Mountain. From that, he created a racial hierarchy, placed Caucasian at the top and everyone else under. This is blatantly false. There is no biological basis for race, and all people originate in Africa. White people are no exception. It's time to phase out this deeply racist language and give the actual Caucasians their regional identity.
I live in America for 7 years and here are the things I don't understand. I was born in Russia, so I'm Russian American now. And can please somebody explain why putting in every single document, in every single questionnaire, option Caucasian and referring to me as to a Caucasian person if I'm obviously not? So that would be considered misidentification, right? But if you misidentify someone's gender, you're in trouble. So someone's personal mistake is unforgivable, and a mistake that ignores almost 200 ethnicities and misidentifying them is completely fine. And second for how come the country that is super overly focused on ethnicities and skin colors doesn't recognize Caucasian region at all, like if they don't exist. So there are okay misidentification errors and not okay ones. Got it.
You know a white person? Do you know a Caucasian person? Did you think that those were the same thing? Well, they actually aren't, and today we're gonna explain why.
The word Caucasian actually comes from the Caucasus Mountains, which is in modern-day Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and parts of Iran, Turkey, and southern Russia. The real Caucasians are the diverse peoples of the Caucasus, who may not fit the stereotype of what a Caucasian is in America, such as a lot of Caucasians practicing Islam, having close ethnic ties to Asian cultures, such as Iranian, and Turkic peoples.
The reason Caucasian became attributed to white people throughout Europe is because of this guy, Johann Blumenbach. Early on during colonization, ideas about race were oftentimes pretty messy and incongruent, but in the 1700s, certain anthropologists started to build careers by adding to the lore of race by traveling and investigating the origins of different racial groups, or as I like to say, just making a bunch of stuff up. When Blumenbach traveled to the Caucasus Mountains, he thought the people there were the most beautiful in the world due to their skull shape, and that white Europeans had to have originated in that area as the middle ground of humanity. And he also thought that his four other races were devolved versions of the Caucasian race.
Now the identity of the Caucasus has been taken by German scientists and his unscientific ideas to further the oppression of colonized peoples around the world.
So when discussing race, it might be better to use the term white to refer to the racial group of people who have ancestral origins in Europe, as opposed to associating all of them.
As a young American living in Moscow explains in this snippet of a video.
Well, basically, what I want to talk about is what is the deal with the Caucasians in Moscow? And I'm not like a racist person or anything, especially because I'm black. Like, how am I going to be racist in Russia about other people? But it's not even that. I mean, like, all right, let me explain. There's always a huge group of them. And it's like, they don't socialize with the Russians there. It's hard to explain. Like, I have a great Caucasian friend from, he lives in Russia. Sorry, I forgot what country he's from. He's probably watching this video right now, but yo, it's early in the morning. I was drinking last night. I'm sure George understands. But I have a great friend named George, you know, he's Caucasian, and he doesn't even like the average Caucasian in Russia. Now, from what I hear from people, is that they're dangerous, they carry knives, they carry guns and all this stuff. And maybe that is, maybe that isn't. But I just want to know the deal, because apparently, from what I hear from a number of Russian people, that Caucasians are disliked more than blacks in Russia, like African black. And I'm like, holy crap, you know, they're hated more than us? I didn't think that was possible.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Historical Africa. Today we are taking a deep dive into a word you have probably seen on forums, in textbooks, and maybe even in police reports or news stories: Caucasian. Most people use it to mean white, but what if I told you that the history behind this word is way wider and way more made up than you think? To understand the real story, we are turning to historian Nell Irvin Painter, author of The History of Whyte People. She breaks down where the word came from, why it caught on, and what it says about how society invented race in the first place. Let's get started.
To the petitioner, that is Abigail Noel Fisher, who is Caucasian. Kennedy's statement prompted a New York Times reporter to ask, has Caucasian lost its meaning? And this article was on the 6th of July, 2013. I'm actually quoted in it. And the reporter, D0WN, notes in her piece, this is her quote, in 1889, the editors of the Oxford English Dictionary noted that the term Caucasian had been practically discarded. 1889. She continues, but they spoke too soon. Blumenbach's authority had given the word a pseudo-scientific sheen that preserved its appeal. Even now, the word gives discussions of race a weird technocratic gravitas, as when the police insist that you step out of your vehicle instead of your car. There is a short answer to my question. Short but opaque. In the late 18th century, Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, an 18th century German scholar, assigned the name to people living in Western Europe, to the River Ob in Russia, to Northern Africa, and to India, called them Caucasian. It's a large group of people. Blumenbach enjoyed a scholarly reputation that gave his designation enormous heft, and it got picked up very quickly. Although the term Caucasian now has many synonyms, including white, it retains a certain currency by dint of repetition. So the short answer is that skull, you see. The fuller and longer answer is complicated, and it entails the history of scholarly exchange, Russian imperialism, and notions of human beauty. So the short answer first. Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, the father of physical anthropology, the father of scientific anthropology, called the people in Europe over to India, well into Russia and North Africa, Caucasians, because they were the most beautiful in the world. And here you have Blumenbach and the skull that inspired the designation. And Blumenbach says, also for the determination of the really most beautiful form of skull, which in my beautiful typical head of a young Georgian female, always of itself attracts every eye, however little observant. So the author of De Generis Humanae Veritate Nativa, written in Latin, Blumenbach had 82 skulls, and this made him an expert in human taxonomy. He made a five-fold designation, a taxonomy of human types. He called them varieties. And he arranged them from left to right. Now, this is not a hierarchical arrangement. Some of you may know Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man. Do you know that book? Yeah. So Gould shows a triangle with the Caucasian skull at the top. That's not the way Blumenbach laid it out. Blumenbach was a believer in the unity of mankind. He was a black bibliophile in the sense that he collected books by black authors. He really believed in the unity of mankind. So he arranged the skulls according to difference. So at the two ends were the Mongolian and the African, and he thought of them as the extremes. In the middle is the beautiful one. It's the gorgeous median, and that's the Caucasian. And then the ones beside the Caucasian are the American and the Malay, because he thought those were the intermediate races. So in short, Blumenbach's most beautiful skull, the one in the middle, gave this large group of people, which we can call white people, but it includes many others, the name Caucasian. Now, a fuller answer. We need to look at Russian imperialism and English imperialism, scholarly networks, and slavery. Slavery, which gave rise to the figure of the odalisque, that is the beautiful white slave girl, as a figure of quintessential beauty. So this is about beauty not only of skulls, but also of slave girls. But whose skulls were these? And how did they get to Blumenbach in Germany? The skull that made white people Caucasian was a gift of Georg von Asch, 1729 to 1807, a Russian of German background who had studied at Blumenbach's Göttingen University. And Asch was considered one of the great fathers of the Göttingen Library and all their collections. So one of the five skulls embodying Blumenbach's human varieties, of those five skulls, two of them came from Asch. Asch also sent skulls and books and all sorts of things. So here we have Asch giving the skull to Göttingen. Now, Asch gave lots of skulls to Blumenbach. Of the 82, something like 20 or 25 came from Asch. Who was this man? He had some nice clothes. That's one thing we know. He was a medical doctor who served in Catherine the Great's armies when Catherine the Great was launched on imperialism at the expense of the Ottoman Empire and others as well. She was a Russian of German background, as many of the aristocratic Russians were, and Asch served her imperial designs. In the 1780s and 1790s, Catherine was taking over the Caucasus. She began with Georgia as a protectorate of Russia in 1783. And remember, the beautiful skull was from Georgia. The Russian conquest of the Caucasus took a century and entailed ethnic cleansing and genocide. And to this day, every time Russian power falters, Caucasians make a break for independence. So, 2 of Blumenbach's 5 skulls from Asch. 2 of Blumenbach's 5 skulls came from a wealthy and influential, ultimately knighted English naturalist named Joseph Banks, 1743 to 1820. Banks had taken part in Captain Cook's first voyage to the South Seas in the 1760s, early 70s. And actually, for California, you know, you probably all think that eucalyptus are native to California, right? Where do they come from? And who brought them there? Banks. I mean, he didn't bring them here. But Banks was one of those people who saw things that would be useful in one place and said, why don't you take them somewhere else? So we can thank Banks for eucalyptus and acacia. He was a very wealthy young man, and as a young man he corresponded with Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy. And he actually employed one of Linnaeus's students as his sort of personal little Linnaeus. So he headed the Royal Society for many years, and he sent Blumenbach the skulls that Blumenbach labeled American and Malay. The Malay one was from Tahiti, and Banks sent his men in the Bounty over to Tahiti to dig up breadfruit. He said breadfruit would be a very useful thing to have in St. Vincent in the Caribbean. Good thing to eat, cheap. So he sent his men out to dig up the breadfruit. They spent months and months and months doing that, and during that time they made liaisons with local women. And one of the reasons for the mutiny on the Bounty was having to leave Tahiti to go to St. Vincent with the breadfruit. So Banks was also a connoisseur of skulls. And he sent the American skull and the Malay skull. So that's, now we've accounted for 4 of the 5 skulls. The 5th skull, which was labeled Ethiopian, came from a professor at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and I have not been able to identify him beyond the name that Blumenbach gave and spelled it Stef Jo van Guns. Can't find him. But we know that the skull is female and that he called it Ethiopian. Blumenbach did not provide the names of 4 of his 5 skulls. He called them typical skulls, but he kept careful records, careful enough that the individuals begin to emerge if we look more closely and bring together the images and the words. So the Mongolian skull is the only skull with a name. It's called Mongolian. Blumenbach calls it Mongolian, but we know that the owner of it lived in Siberia. This is one of Asch's skulls. The Ethiopian, we know, was the common law wife of a man who brought her from West Africa, to the Netherlands, and considering the traffic, probably she was from Ghana, what we now call Ghana, and we know that she died in Amsterdam in her 28th year. The American lived in the Caribbean island of St. Vincent, and this is the St. Vincent where Banks had close friends, including the head of the Royal Garden. So we know that the Carib chief's bones were dug up for Banks and then sent to Blumenbach. And then the skull labeled Malay belonged to a Tahitian, most likely one of the wives or girlfriends of the sailors whom Banks had sent to dig up breadfruit trees. The one in the middle, the Caucasian, a Georgian woman, very young by the look of her teeth. Do any of you know what used to happen to women when they became pregnant? What happened to their teeth? Lots of cavities and fewer teeth. So before the age of fluoride and good dentists, when women got pregnant, they very often lost their teeth. This woman has all her teeth. This is a very young woman whose fate was exceedingly unhappy. A young Georgian female, after her venereal sudden death, sent to the Theatrum Anatomicum for legal abduction. That is to say, after she died of venereal disease, a scientist boiled her down and sent her skull to Asch, and Asch sent it to Göttingen, to Blumenbach. The Georgian's death through sex and Blumenbach's linking of Caucasians with beauty belongs to a longer tradition. I don't know when the tradition started. I know it goes back to the 17th century in Western Europe. I suspect it may be of Ottoman or Iranian beginnings. Now remember Blumenbach's hymn to the beauty of his Georgian skull? Really the most beautiful form of skull in which my beautiful typical head of a young Georgian female. In this regard, Blumenbach joined a tradition dating back to the 17th century that called Caucasians, Circassians, or Georgians the most beautiful people in the world. And this, at least in that part of the world, is a tradition that lives on.
Мне нужна только ты и больше никто, пойми, ведь я люблю тебя и больше никого, больше никого, больше никого, больше никого. Мне нужна только ты, не знаю, есть тебя парень или нет. Хотел бы ты быть со мной или нет, но обо всем мне думать очень грустно.
Nice looking people, huh? And young. One of the earliest Europeans to attempt to categorize people by body type was François Bernier, 1625 to 1688, a French physician and traveler who became the personal physician of the Mughal Emperor of India for 12 years. In the image that I've made for you, Bernier sits down below there by the bush under his more illustrious compatriot, Jean Chardin. Bernier's 1684 publication, Nouvelle division de la Terre par les différentes espèces ou races qui l'habitent, is considered the first post-classical classification of humans into distinct races. In Nouvelle division de la Terre, he had referred to the beauty of Circassian women as assumed by all the travelers. All the travelers. In a 1667 letter from Shiraz, Persia, Bernier described the burning of widows in India. At this point in his career, he was evidently going around watching widows being burnt, because he described several of the burnings, older ones, younger ones, and so forth. And at one burning, he was together with Jean Chardin, who was another illustrious French traveler who was also a jewelry merchant. It was Chardin's description of beautiful Georgians that Blumenbach quoted in his book as proof that Circassian beauty or Georgian beauty was agreed upon by scientists. Chardin's Journal du voyage de Chevalier Chardin en Perse et aux Indes orientales par la mer Noire et le Couchide, 1689. This book is the authority that Blumenbach refers to when he speaks about Georgian beauty. For Chardin, the blood of Georgia is the most beautiful in the Orient, and I would have to say in the world, for I have never noticed an ugly face of either sex in this country, and some are downright angelic. Nature has endowed most of the women with graces not to be seen in any other place. I have to say it is impossible to look at them without falling in love with them. And this is a quote from Chardin. And Chardin is, together with contemporary Georgians, that is, Georgians of our time, and also the most famous Georgian of the 20th century, Joseph Stalin. Now, by the time Blumenbach wrote in the late 18th century, Chardin's view was commonplace. And the world's most illustrious philosopher, Immanuel Kant, agrees with Chardin and with Blumenbach. In Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime of 1763, Kant says, Circassian and Georgian maidens have always been considered extremely pretty by all Europeans who travel through their lands. And Kant goes on to repeat something that appears over and over and over again in this literature, that the Caucasians, the Georgians, the Circassians sell their children, particularly their girls, to the Turks and to the Arabs and the Persians for reasons of what we would call eugenics, that is, to beautify the race. And then Kant and all the others slime the Turks by saying they really need it. Exactly. Now, much better known in the English-speaking world was a traveler and Cambridge professor named Edward Daniel Clarke, 1769 to 1822. Clarke wrote Travels in Various Countries of Europe, Asia, and Africa, first published in 1810, but republished and revised and republished and revised, republished in the United States as well. So Clarke was a much better known authority in the United States on this issue than Kant or Chardin or Bernier. And for Clarke, again, as an eyewitness, he also testified that the women of the Caucasus are the most beautiful in the world. He was a tutor in Jesus College in Cambridge University, a member of the Academy of Sciences in Berlin, and the Cambridge Philosophical Society, and many other learned societies that formed an important scholarly network. So in Clarke's work, the notion of Circassian beauty or Georgian beauty is taken for granted. Now, what is this lady? This is 1850s, a Circassian beauty in the United States. This is Barnum's American Museum, and in the 1850s and 60s, Barnum showed several women, all with afros, as Circassian beauties, the most beautiful women in the world, and for American audiences, examples of white purity. Now, why the headdress? Or why the hair? I mean, we know why the hair. She had hair like this and she let it grow. But why was this associated with Circassians? This is the headdress of Circassian warriors. So the woman in New York, her hair echoes the headdress. Now, over and over again, in the authorities I've mentioned to you, the idea of the beauty of Caucasians is linked with the idea of the slavery of Caucasians. So before the Atlantic slave trade to the Western Hemisphere shaped our ideas about what slave trades are all about, there was a slave trade from this part of the world, that is the Caucasus, Ukraine, Crimea, and so forth. And that trade goes back before the reaches of time. This is Herodotus. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, writing about the enumeration of taxes and tributes paid to the Persian kingdom, collected from the lands that it controlled and the lands even far away in the distance. He said that a voluntary contribution was taken by the Colchians, that is the Georgians, and the neighboring tribes between them and the Caucasus, and it consisted of, and still consists of, that is in the 5th century BC, every 4th year, 100 boys and 100 girls. This was before Herodotus could even see the beginnings of it. I should add, Herodotus also mentioned a tribute from the southernmost part of the edges of the Persian world, and that was for people called Ethiopians, and what they owed was gold and ivory. People were not mentioned. So the Black Sea slave trade was the slave trade in the Western world until the 15th century, when the Ottomans captured Constantinople and cut the Black Sea off from Western Europe. At that point, 15th century, the Atlantic slave trade becomes the Western slave trade. So let's go back to Jean Chardin for a moment. His famous words of 1689 actually described a familiar experience in the Black Sea in the 1660s. This was Chardin, who was in the cameo there. Chardin was actually on a voyage to India to buy jewelry, but he couldn't go his usual way, the southern way, so he went through the Caucasus, which he hated. He hated it. But in the Black Sea area, he describes a situation where he was on a boat with captives, with slaves. And he talks about one particular woman who was 25 with a smooth, even, lily-white complexion and admirably beautiful features. I have never before seen such beautifully rounded breasts. That beautiful woman inspired overall sensations of desire and compassion. Now, it turned out that on that voyage and on that boat was a Greek trader, and Greeks handled that long-standing Black Sea slave trade. So Chardin tells us what people cost. He says in crowns. I have translated it into pounds so you can get a sense of what we're talking about. Pretty girls aged 13 to 18 went for about 60 pounds. Plainer girls for less. Women went for about 36 pounds. Children from 9 to 12 pounds. Men aged 25 to 40 for about 45 pounds. Those older, only about 24 pounds to 30 pounds. The Greek merchant whose room was next to Chardin's on the boat bought that beautiful woman with the baby at her breast for about 36 pounds. Daniel Edward Clark, our Cambridge Don, also located Circassian beauty or Caucasian beauty in the enslaved. The Circassians frequently sell their children to strangers, particularly to Persians and Turkish seraglios. The most beautiful prisoners of both sexes go there. He speaks of one particular Circassian female who was 14, who was conscious of her great beauty, who feared her parents would sell her according to the custom of the country. How much? The women selling generally from 25 to 30 rubles apiece, somewhat less than the price of a horse. The beautiful young slave girl.
You have probably seen the word on official documents, race, Caucasian, but many people did not realize that this word was never meant to be a scientific category, and definitely not a biological one. Painter teaches that our common idea of Caucasian is something we inherited, not something that is natural or scientifically proven. So where did this actually came from? Let's rewind. The term Caucasian, originally referred to as Caucasus, a mountain region between Eastern Europe and Western Asia, near places like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The funny part, most people who check the box Caucasian today have zero connection to this area. Painter stresses this mismatch to show that racial categories often have little to do with geographical or genetics. They came from ideas and stories people decided to believe. The next major character in this story is Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, an 18th century scientist who was obsessed with classifying humans. He collected skulls the way some people collect funky pops, and he believed he could divide humanity into broader groups or races based on skull shape. Today, we know human variation is way too complex for that, but back then, this was considered cutting-edge science. And here is where things get interesting. Blumenbach had a skull from the Caucasus region, specifically from Georgia, that he thought was especially beautiful. And because he thought that skull was ID, he declared that this region represented the original or best race. Painter points out the obvious issue. This science was really just aesthetic preference dressed up as biology. Imagine creating a whole racial category because you like how one skull looked. That is basically what happened. So how did we get from one beautiful skull to millions of people calling themselves Caucasian? The irony is that people in the actual Caucasus region were not the ones benefiting from this label. Europeans basically grabbed the name to elevate themselves. Here is something Painter really emphasizes. Not all Europeans used to be considered white. In the 1800s and early 1900s, groups like Italians, Irish people, and Jewish were not always treated as fully white in the United States. Instead, they were sometimes viewed as racially different or inferior. The idea of Caucasian helped smooth over this division by creating a broader umbrella category that could eventually include more European groups. According to Painter, this shows that race is flexible. It changes depending on whose society to include or exclude at a given time. Using a term that sounded academic or ancient helped justify social hierarchies, especially in the United States, where systems like slavery and segregation were still shaping society. Caucasian made whiteness sound official. It gave it a kind of mythical history, even though the actual origins were shaky at best. So why do we still see Caucasian or forms today? Painter explained that the word stuck because people like using terms that sound scientific even when they are not. It became a part of a legal document, census form, and everyday language. Once something is written into institutions, it tends to stay there. But Painter is clear, the category is invented, not biological. Modern genetics has shown that humans are far more similar than different. Skin color, hair texture, and other features vary gradually, not in net boxes. Painter's work helps show that Caucasian does not describe a real biological group. It describes a historical idea shaped by old beliefs and power structures. Thank you for watching, guys. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.